If you have a God who is all-powerful and all-loving, how does enduring evil just coexist alongside him? Why not just snap his fingers and end the rebellion right then and there? Honestly, it's one of the oldest and most profound questions in all of theology and philosophy.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really solve this puzzle, we first need to ground ourselves in something called theodicy. Basically, this is the formal attempt to reconcile an all-powerful, all-loving God with the very real, very harsh existence of evil and suffering. It's the exact lens theologians use to make sense of what seems totally senseless, and it gives us the framework we need to approach this whole mystery today.
Now, when we look across different theological traditions, especially within Christianity, we don't just find one simple, single-sentence answer to the problem of evil. It's a lot more complex than that. Instead, Christian theology offers 4 distinct overlapping rationales for why a higher power would permit fallen angels to stick around rather than just instantly deleting them. We're going to break down every single one of these 4 pillars.
Take a look at the stark contrast here between forced erasure and genuine love. The logic is actually incredibly tight. For love, loyalty, and obedience to mean anything at all, they have to be chosen freely. If God created beings who can choose good, they absolutely must have the capacity to choose the opposite, evil. Because if God just immediately destroyed any being the exact millisecond they exercised their free will to rebel, well then free will is just an illusion, right? It would mean obedience is maintained entirely through forced erasure. And that makes true, genuine love literally impossible.
And this applies directly to the angelic realm. In Christian theology, angels were created as highly intelligent beings with totally free choice. The tradition holds that Satan, or Lucifer, chose pride and self-exaltation over submission. So allowing him to exist, rather than just wiping him out, is understood as a way of respecting the permanent, weighty consequence of that ultimate free will. The choice was real, so the consequences of that choice have to be real too.
Now, what's really interesting about this concept is the idea of a stealth deletion. Imagine if God had simply blinked Satan out of existence the very moment he rebelled. What kind of message does that send to all the other unfallen angels? Theologians suggest that those remaining angels might have served God from that day forward out of sheer terror of being annihilated. They wouldn't be serving out of genuine love or trust in his goodness. No, they'd be serving under the constant threat of a cosmic delete button.
So instead of a stealth deletion, there's this strategy of allowing the rebellion to play out organically, and this serves a massive cosmic purpose. It demonstrates to all of creation the total destructive bankruptcy of living apart from God. The misery, the chaos, the utter failure of evil, they aren't just accidents. They actually become an eternal, undeniable proof of why God's laws exist in the first place. It proves righteousness by putting the alternative on full public display. This brilliantly illustrates a really key concept. God actually uses the presence of temptation and opposition to accomplish a greater spiritual purpose. Philosophers like Irenaeus and Alvin Plantinga argue that without an adversary, the very concept of choice just completely disappears. The presence of temptation provides a necessary backdrop. Virtue isn't just the passive absence of sin, it requires an active, intentional conquest over it.
This is what those philosophers call the soul-making theodicy, and it really grounds all this lofty theology right into our everyday reality. It essentially views Earth as a training ground for human souls. Think about it. Overcoming the struggles, the trials, and the deceptions introduced by fallen spiritual forces actively refines human character. A completely sterile, challenge-free paradise, it simply cannot build that kind of deep, tested resilience. Your character is quite literally forged in the crucible of opposition.
Let's trace this eschatological timeline. First, we have Epoch 1, the initial rebellion. Right now, you and I, we are sitting squarely in Epoch 2, human history and grace. And all of this is moving towards Epoch 3, the final judgment. What this progression clearly demonstrates is that Satan's destruction is not canceled. It's simply deferred. And this delay is incredibly purposeful. It is definitely not a lack of power on God's part, it's entirely a matter of divine timing. Allowing history to play out provides the window of grace and time necessary for the human race to exist, to experience life, and ultimately to make a choice about salvation. Scripture and theology pointing to texts like Matthew 25:41 and Revelation 20 make it clear that the ultimate fate of fallen angels is already definitively sealed in eternal fire. The end is already written, we're just living through the necessary delay.
To pull this all together, think of a chess master. When an amateur makes a flawed, rebellious move on the board, the true master doesn't just flip the table in a rage to prove superiority. That's that stealth deletion we talked about earlier. Instead, the master allows the game to play out, right? He uses the opponent's own flawed moves to bring about an undeniable absolute checkmate. And that proves mastery beyond a shadow of a doubt to absolutely anyone watching the game.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final thought. How might your own struggles be part of a larger, soul-making strategy? If a grand cosmic strategy actually utilizes opposition to forge genuine character and resilience, how does that reframe the challenges you're facing today? Right out of the gate, the text establishes that Satan operates on a really tight leash. He is totally subordinate to God's ultimate sovereignty. And what's truly fascinating here is the original Greek word used in the texts, exaiteomai. In the book of Luke, chapter 22, when Satan wants to sift the disciple Peter like wheat, he can't just attack him. No way. He literally has to file a formal request in a divine courtroom to get permission. It is a strict legal procedure.
This classic passage from the book of Job perfectly illustrates that legal framework. Notice how Satan actually recognizes a divine hedge of protection around the believer. The dialogue is incredible here. He explicitly acknowledges this hedge, knowing full well he absolutely cannot breach it unless God intentionally lowers it for a specific season.
Once permission is granted, God doesn't just let chaos reign. Not at all. There are specific parameters in play. The text outlines these three rigid limits: the boundary line limit, the human capacity limit, and the structural outcome limit. This proves that every single trial operates under a dynamic of highly controlled chaos.
Limit number 1 is purely physical. God dictates the exact boundary line. Take the story of Job, for example. God initially allows Satan to touch Job's wealth, but strictly forbids him from touching his body. Later on, God expands that boundary to Job's health, but commands him to spare his life. Satan is completely powerless to cross that rigid operational boundary by even a single inch.
Then we have the second parameter, the human capacity limit. God guarantees that the sheer intensity of any trial or temptation will never exceed your structural integrity. The text in 1 Corinthians puts it perfectly. God simply won't let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, and He will always provide a way of escape.
Think of it this way. God acts as a sort of universal regulator. If a trial coming your way is heavy enough to permanently break your faith, the framework tells us that God either filters it out entirely before it reaches you, or He steps in right then and there to provide that guaranteed escape route.
And finally, limit number 3, the structural outcome. Now, Satan's intent in these tests is absolute ruin and spiritual death, right? However, God actually limits that ultimate outcome. He completely reverses the intended destruction into a crucible that purifies your character. Just like with Job, where his character was ultimately purified and his loss is restored, the structure guarantees that the end result ultimately serves a purpose of growth. Having established how trials happen, we hit a razor-sharp theological divide: the difference between God testing and Satan tempting. The original texts use 2 entirely different words for this. When God tests, the Greek word is dikonso, He acts like a master jeweler, melting down gold to remove the impurities and prove it's genuine. He's revealing your structural strength to build you up. But when Satan tempts, purazo, it is designed purely as a trap. It's meant to entice you, expose your structural weakness, and just break you down entirely. When we map this dynamic out side by side, a really stark contrast emerges. Notice how Satan's malicious intent to expose weakness and cause despair is constantly boxed in by God's sovereign rules of engagement. Satan always has to ask permission, while God sets the rules, refines the faith, and guarantees that escape route. Now, this passage from James clarifies something absolutely crucial: the source of the impulse. Listen, God might provide a difficult external season to test your reliance on Him, but He will never internally entice you to sin. That internal twisting of your legitimate human needs into illegitimate actions, that comes entirely from your own desires being actively exploited by the enemy. Let's make this concrete. Section 4, the wilderness case study, Jesus in the desert. In Matthew chapter 4, we see this whole dual dynamic play out in one single practical event. Jesus is fasting for 40 days. The text says, the Holy Spirit led Jesus to the desert for a test of obedience. That's God's purpose. But right on cue, Satan arrives to turn that exact same circumstance into a temptation by exploiting Jesus' very real physical hunger.
urging him to just turn stones into bread. It was a test of obedience from God and a temptation to break that obedience from Satan. Ultimately, Jesus passed by actively resisting with Scripture.
Comparing these features head-to-head reveals the ultimate impact on the believer. The voice of God's testing brings conviction, which is actually constructive and leads to peace and spiritual maturity. Conversely, the voice of Satan's temptation is pure accusation. It targets your flesh and your appetites, leading directly to shame and spiritual stagnation.
So what's the big takeaway from all this source material today? It's that every difficult spiritual trial is literally a double-sided coin. What Satan designs as a targeted trap to make you quit, fear, or fail, God is simultaneously using as the exact same circumstance to test your endurance, purify your faith, and prepare you for exactly what's coming next. I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on regarding your own circumstances. When you're facing your heaviest trials, which side of the coin is capturing your focus? The temptation to break or the test to grow? Understanding these biblical rules of engagement changes the entire way we perceive our spiritual strength.
Okay, let's dive into this. Forget the pitchforks, forget the red tights, and definitely forget the little cartoon horns you see everywhere around Halloween. Those are completely modern inventions. We have to ask ourselves, what does biblical evil actually look like according to the original texts? We're going to shatter some pop culture illusions today and treat this like the captivating historical and literary mystery it truly is. Let's start with a visceral, frankly terrifying image. 1 Peter 5:8 warns believers that the devil prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. I mean, just think about what a lion represents in the wild. This isn't subtle at all. The roaring lion represents aggressive intimidation. It's that sudden, brutal, terrifying spiritual attack designed to completely paralyze you with fear and overwhelm you with brute force. Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast. On the left, we've got that brute force, the aggressive intimidation of the roaring lion we just talked about. But look over at the right side, the angel of light. 2 Corinthians 11:14 points out that evil often masquerades as something incredibly beautiful. This is counterfeit holiness. It's the tactic of appearing good, noble, or even deeply religious on the outside, specifically to lead people astray. It's the profound difference between a violent, sudden ambush and a slow, beautiful infiltration. And speaking of subtle infiltration, we absolutely have to look at the original shape of evil in these ancient texts, the serpent. Appearing right at the very beginning in Genesis 3 and later explicitly named in Revelation 22, the serpent represents pure deception. It employs this subtle cunning to deliver its spiritual poison. And it reminds us that evil so often starts as a quiet, reasonable-sounding whisper rather than a terrifying roar. But you know, evil doesn't always stay small and settle. It scales up. From the quiet serpent, we transition to this massive entity, the great red dragon of Revelation 12:3. This beast is massive in scale, depicted with 7 terrifying heads and 10 horns. This is no longer just about personal deception. This symbol represents fierce, destructive, and tyrannical political and spiritual power completely arrayed against God. It is evil operating on an institutional, world-dominating level. So the crucial point is that Satan, in these texts, is not a single static monster. He's a shapeshifter. He's constantly adapting to different tactical situations. The serpent brings deception and spiritual poison. The dragon wields tyrannical political power. The lion relies on aggressive intimidation, and the angel of light utilizes counterfeit holiness. It's a highly dynamic, incredibly adaptable bestiary designed to attack in completely 6. It is arguably the most infamous digit in all of human history. Just hearing it probably evokes a reaction for you. But what does it actually mean in its original context? The number comes directly from Revelation 13:18, which reads, "This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. Notice the incredibly specific language here. This isn't meant to just be a spooky number to scare people. It's a direct invitation from the author to the reader to actively solve a riddle. Which naturally leads us to a very obvious tension-building question. Why this specific number? And how exactly do you go about trying to calculate a name? We don't usually do math on people's names today, do we? Act 3. Cracking the Ancient Code. To understand how to calculate a name, you've got to understand something called gematria. See, in ancient times, languages like Hebrew, Greek, and Latin didn't have separate symbols for numbers, like the Arabic numerals 1, 2, and 3 we use today. Instead, their alphabet letters served double duty as their numbers. So gematria is the practice of adding up the numerical value of the letters in a person's name to get a total numerical sum. This is the big aha moment. To ancient readers, a number wasn't just a number, it was often a hidden name. And when we apply this ancient practice to our text, we discover that the number 666 actually operates as a highly sophisticated cipher. It carries two distinct but deeply connected meanings, a historical meaning and a symbolic meaning. To truly grasp the brilliance of this text, we have to look at both of these dual layers. Let's start with the historical meaning, which points directly to Nero Caesar. Nero was a notoriously tyrannical Roman emperor who brutally persecuted early Christians. To the original readers of this text who were experiencing this horrific oppression firsthand, Nero was the living, breathing embodiment of that massive, destructive dragon's political tyranny we talked about earlier. He was the ultimate historical archetype of the beast. Let's move to and see how this builds mathematically. Step 1. You take the name Nero Caesar. Step 2. You translate his name into Hebrew letters, which looks like Neron Caesar. Step 3, you add up the specific numerical value assigned to those Hebrew letters. The result? It adds up exactly to 666. It was a brilliant secret code that allowed the author to talk about the terrifying Roman emperor without actually writing his name down and risking treason. But honestly, the genius of the text doesn't stop there. We also have the symbolic meaning. In biblical numerology, numbers carry immense theological weight. On the left, we have the number 7. 7 represents divine perfection, completeness, and God's rest. Remember, God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th? Contrast that with the right side, the number 6. 6 represents humanity, because humanity was created on the 6th day. 6 represents imperfection. It comes close to 7, but it ultimately falls short. And this brilliantly illustrates the deep metaphor at play here. 777 represents ultimate, Trinitarian divine perfection, but 666 is utterly falling short. It is a failed mimicry of God. It's the trinity of human imperfection. The beast isn't just a scary monster. It is a human system or a person trying to elevate itself to divine status, trying to play God, but completely and miserably failing. Let's pull this all together. When we look at this in summary, we really see how beautifully layered the ancient text actually is. On the historical layer, 666 means Nero Caesar, representing very real oppressive political tyranny that the early readers faced. On the symbolic layer, it is 6 constantly falling short of 7, representing human imperfection, trying to mimic God. It's just a masterclass in writing. It's both a literal historical survival code and a profound theological statement rolled into 3 digits. Which brings us to our final provocative thought. If 666 fundamentally represents human systems trying to mimic the divine, demanding absolute allegiance, but falling miserably short, where do we still see the spirit of the beast today? The symbols and the numbers might be ancient, but the human nature they describe certainly hasn't changed. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time as we continue to make the complex perfectly clear.
Thanks for watching.
Stay blessed and don't forget to share this video with everyone.